There's a clay tablet in the British Museum that most visitors walk past without a second glance. It sits in a climate-controlled case on the third floor, catalogue number K3375, labelled simply as a creation myth from ancient Mesopotamia. The card beneath it offers a tidy explanation about Sumerian religious beliefs, the usual academic framing that keeps everything safely in the realm of mythology. But if you lean close to the glass and trace the wedge-shaped impressions with your eyes, following the lines that ancient scribes pressed into wet clay over 4,000 years ago, you'll notice something unsettling. Something that doesn't quite fit the comfortable narrative of primitive people inventing stories to explain their world. This isn't a creation myth in the way we've been taught to understand myths. It's a production log, a technical document. The text describes not one act of divine creation, but multiple attempts, trial after trial, prototype after prototype, failed experiment after failed experiment, being so malformed they couldn't stretch out their hands to grasp tools, creatures born blind, unable to navigate the world independently, humans who couldn't control basic bodily functions, their bodies betraying them with incontinence. A barren woman, unable to fulfill what ancient societies considered the primary function of womanhood. A being without gender, existing in a third category that shouldn't exist in a simple binary system. And finally, most disturbingly, a creature so fundamentally broken it could neither speak nor eat nor move properly, existing in a state that the ancient text itself describes as neither alive nor dead. These aren't poetic metaphors for human disability appearing in an already established species. These aren't symbolic representations of the diversity of human conditions. The structure of the text doesn't support that reading. What we're looking at is something more unsettling. A systematic catalogue, a list of failures, the rejected models from a development process, the prototypes that didn't meet specifications and were either repurposed for limited functions or discarded entirely. The ancient scribes who pressed these cuneiform symbols into wet clay weren't recording religious mythology in the way a priest might record a parable. They were documenting something far stranger, far more specific. This reads like a laboratory report from the dawn of humanity. The failures that came before success, the experimental models that had to be refined, adjusted, and ultimately replaced before the final version could be rolled out. What makes this remarkable isn't just the failures described in exacting clinical detail, it's what comes after in the broader mythological record, a gap, a missing chapter, a catastrophic event that the texts describe as a great flood sent to wipe the slate clean. And then, rising from the waters, a second creation, a completely new humanity fashioned from different materials, using different methods, carrying different genetic instructions, subject to different limitations. The math doesn't work for gradual evolution. The timeline is too abrupt, the change is too fundamental. It's as if someone erased the first draft entirely and started over with hard-won knowledge from the initial failure. The question archaeologists won't ask aloud, the question that hovers unspoken in academic conferences and journal peer reviews, is devastatingly simple. If humans were created twice, if the texts are describing something that actually happened rather than purely symbolic religious allegory, what happened to the first version? Where did they go? Why did the Anunnaki gods, these beings from the heavens who claim to have fashioned us, need to try again? What went so catastrophically wrong with humanity at one point? Oh, that total extinction and complete replacement became necessary. The answer, it turns out, lies not in a single text, but scattered across dozens of clay tablets, geological layers showing catastrophic disruption, genetic evidence of population bottlenecks, and the strange haunting gaps in both the human fossil record and the archaeological timeline of civilization. Tonight, as the day fades and your thoughts begin to slow, I'm going to take you back to those ancient laboratories, real or mythological, where the boundary between God and genetics, between divine will and biological engineering, was measured in handfuls of clay and drops of divine blood. Close your eyes if you'd like. The world I'm building exists better in shadow, in the space between memory and history, where myths preserve truths that scientific materialism hasn't yet found the framework to properly decode. You won't need visuals for this journey. Just your imagination and the willingness to follow a trail of evidence that leads somewhere most scholars fear to tread. Into a territory where ancient texts might be describing literal events through the only vocabulary available to pre-scientific cultures, and where cosmic catastrophes, genetic engineering, and the cyclical rise and fall of civilizations converge into a pattern that's either the most extraordinary coincidence in human history or evidence of something we've been systematically trained not to see. Before we go deeper, before we descend into the clay archives and the geological record and the strange silences in our own DNA, if this resonates with you, a quiet like helps others find these stories, these journeys through the forgotten places where history and mystery intersect. I'm curious, where in the world are you drifting off from tonight? What time is it there? Leave a gentle comment if you'd like, a small mark of your presence in this moment, this quiet space we're sharing across time and distance. Now settle in, dim the lights, let the soft hum of the world fade into background noise, the way ancient sounds must have faded for the Sumerians as they pressed their styluses into clay, recording things they'd been told by gods or priests or something in between, because tonight we're not just exploring ancient myths, we're reconstructing a crime scene. A crime scene 12,800 years old, give or take a few centuries. The evidence is there, preserved in clay and stone and the deep scars carved into the earth itself. The story of humanity's double creation. The first attempt that went catastrophically wrong, and the reset that made us who we are today, for better or worse, for blessing or curse. The library at Nineveh was burning. The year was 612 BCE and the great capital of the Assyrian Empire, the most powerful, brutal and sophisticated civilization the Near East had yet seen, was falling to a coalition of Babylonians, Medes, and Scythians who wanted not just conquest but total erasure. They succeeded beyond their wildest expectations. The palaces crumbled, reduced to rubble. The temples collapsed, their gods powerless to intervene. The city walls that had seemed impregnable were breached and torn down. And the vast royal library of King Ashurbanipal, that eccentric scholar king who had collected obsessively, gathered systematically, and preserved meticulously the accumulated wisdom of 3,000 years of Mesopotamian civilization, 20,000 clay tablets representing everything from astronomical tables to medical texts to epic poetry was consumed by flames. The invaders meant to destroy knowledge itself. They understood that power comes not just from soldiers and walls but from information, from the accumulated learning of generations. They wanted to erase the Assyrians not just from the map but from history, to make it as if they had never been. But clay, in one of those beautiful ironies of history, has a property that makes it almost indestructible. When baked hard by intense heat, it becomes eternal. The very flames meant to destroy Ashurbanipal's library instead fired those tablets into ceramic permanence, preserving them for millennia. What the invaders meant to erase, they inadvertently immortalized. Fast forward 2,500 years to the mid-19th century. The British Museum is engaged in what can only be called archaeological pillaging, but let's use the more polite term from the period, collecting antiquities. British archaeologist Austin Henry Layard and his Armenian assistant Hormuzd Rassam are excavating the ruins of ancient Nineveh, now just mounds of earth in modern Iraq. They unearth thousands of these fire-hardened tablets and ship them back to London in crates. The tablets arrive at the museum and are catalogued, numbered, stored in basements. For decades they sit there unread, their cuneiform script still largely a mystery despite the best efforts of scholars working to crack the code of these strange wedge-shaped impressions. Then in 1872, a self-taught genius named George Smith, who started his working life as a banknote engraver, a skilled craftsman but by no means an academic, begins the painstaking, obsessive work of translation. Smith taught himself cuneiform by spending every spare moment in the British Museum, studying, comparing, slowly building his understanding. What he discovers among those thousands of fragments changes everything. On December 3rd, 1872, he's working his way through a tablet from the library of Ashurbanipal when he realizes what he's reading. His hands start to shake. According to witnesses, he leapt up from his desk, began pacing frantically, and in his excitement, reportedly began removing his clothes, a detail that Victorian sensibilities found scandalous but which speaks to the absolute shock of his discovery. What Smith had found sent shockwaves through Victorian England that reverberate to this day. Here, written in Akkadian cuneiform, dated to approximately 1700 BCE, a full 1,000 years before the earliest known biblical texts, was the story of a great flood. A man warned by a god that destruction is coming. Instructions to build a boat of specific dimensions, command to save his family and representatives of all animal life. The gathering storm, the waters rising, the world drowning, days of devastation. A mountain landfall, a dove sent out that returns, a swallow that returns, a raven that doesn't return, signalling dry land. A sacrifice made that draws the gods like flies to sweet smoke. A covenant established, a promise of no more such destruction. The British Museum was in uproar. George Smith was invited to lecture before the Society of Biblical Archaeology. The Prime Minister himself attended. Newspapers around the world carried the story on their front pages. Everything the Western world thought they knew about the origins of their most sacred narratives had just been called into question. The Bible wasn't the first. It wasn't the original divine revelation. It was the echo, the descendant, the later version of something much, much older that had originated in Mesopotamia. The Genesis flood wasn't unique. It was borrowed, adapted, transformed, but rooted in earlier Near Eastern tradition. But Smith, in his feverish work translating more and more tablets, found something else, something the newspapers didn't report because it didn't fit the comfortable, if challenging narrative of flood stories predating the Bible. He found detailed accounts of human creation, not the poetic, brief creation accounts of Genesis with its "let us make man in our image," not symbolic, allegorical storytelling designed to convey theological truths. This was something different, something clinical, technical, a process described with the precision of a laboratory protocol, the kind of systematic documentation you'd expect from scientists keeping records of experimental procedures. The texts speak of gods, the Anunnaki, mixing clay from specific locations with blood from a sacrificed divine being. They describe birth goddesses acting as surrogate mothers, their wombs implanted with prepared genetic material. They specify gestation periods, note the successful birth of 7 males and 7 females. They document not just the how, but the why, to create workers, servants, a slave species to bear the labour the gods themselves no longer wish to perform. And crucially, disturbingly, they speak of failures, many failures, an entire catalogue of beings created and then discarded or repurposed, prototypes deemed unfit for the intended purpose. This isn't metaphor. The structure of these texts, the systematic way they list each failed creation with its specific defect and what was done with it, reads like quality control documentation, like troubleshooting notes, like the kind of records you'd keep when refining a complex biological process through multiple iterations. The most complete account comes from a text we now call the Atrahasis Epic, named after its human hero, Atrahasis the Exceedingly Wise. The oldest surviving copies of this epic date to around 1700 BCE, during the reign of the Babylonian king Hammurabi's dynasty, though linguistic analysis and references in even earlier texts suggest the story itself is far older, passed down through generations, edited and refined, but preserving a core narrative that may stretch back to the very dawn of Sumerian civilization in the 4th millennium BCE. The epic opens not with the creation of the world, which it takes as already accomplished, but with a crisis in heaven, a labour dispute, a rebellion. When the gods instead of man did the work, bore the loads, the gods' load was too great, the work too hard, the trouble too much. This is the setup. For 40 years, the junior gods, called the Agigi, have been engaged in backbreaking labour. They've been digging irrigation canals, dredging rivers, moving massive amounts of earth to create the agricultural infrastructure of Mesopotamia. They're exhausted beyond endurance. They're resentful, watching their superiors, the Anunnaki, live in comfort while they toil. And finally, after 4 decades of this grinding work, they reach their breaking point. They rebel. The scene is dramatic. The Agigi gather outside the house of Enlil, the chief god on earth, the commander of operations, the stern disciplinarian who assigned them this work. They don't just voice complaints. They burn their tools in a ritual act of defiance. They refuse to work another day. It's a full strike, a worker uprising in heaven. Enlil is furious, his divine pride wounded, his authority challenged. He wants to punish the rebels severely, make brutal examples of the ringleaders, crush the uprising with overwhelming force to prevent any future insubordination. But Enki, the god of wisdom and the fresh waters, the clever scientist and diplomat of the pantheon, proposes a different solution. A revolutionary idea that will change the course of life on Earth. Don't punish the workers for rebelling against unjust conditions, he argues. That will only breed more resentment, more future rebellions. Instead, remove the source of the problem. Replace the workers entirely. Create a new being, a substitute species, specifically designed and engineered to do the labour the gods no longer wish to perform. Let there be a primitive worker, Enki declares to the divine council. Let him bear the yoke of the gods. Let man assume the drudgery of the god. The council debates. This is unprecedented. Creating a new sentient species, one designed from the start to be subservient, carries risks. But the alternative is either endless labour for the Igigi, breeding more resentment, or living without the benefits that labour provides. The Anunnaki make their decision. Proceed with the creation project. But creating a new sentient species from scratch isn't a simple matter of divine will, not even for gods. It requires materials, it requires a plan, it requires experimentation, and it requires sacrifice. The texts describe the procedure with unsettling specificity that sounds less like religious mythology and more like a technical manual. A god must die. The text names him Ailu, though he's also called Geshtu-E in other versions. He's not chosen at random from among the divine ranks. The text is specific about this. He's described as a god who has intelligence, who has sense, who possesses Temu. This is crucial to understanding what comes next. They don't choose just any deity for this ritual sacrifice, they deliberately select one whose essence contains the specific quality they want to impart to their creation, the ability to think, to reason, to understand commands and instructions, to be trainable. Ailu is ritually slaughtered by the assembled gods. His blood, described in the text as containing his essence, his spirit, his intelligence, is collected. His flesh is prepared. These divine materials are then mixed with clay, but not just any clay. The text specifies it must come from a particular location, the Abzu, the primordial freshwater ocean believed to exist deep beneath the earth. The domain of Enki himself. This is the purest clay, uncontaminated by surface impurities, the original earth material. This mixture of divine blood and flesh with sacred clay is then handed to Nintu, the mother goddess. She's also called Ninhursag in some texts, or Ninmah in others, but her function remains constant. She is the womb goddess, the birth goddess, the divine specialist in biological creation and reproduction. The mixture is divided carefully into 14 equal portions, 7 for males, 7 for females. The text is precise about this bilateral creation from the start. These 14 portions of prepared genetic material, this divine terrestrial hybrid substance, are then implanted into the wombs of 14 birth goddesses, who will act as surrogates. The text names some of them: Ninimma, Shuziana, Ninmada, Ninbarig, Ninmug, Ninguna. They're assisted by Nintu herself acting as chief midwife. This isn't spontaneous divine generation. This is a carefully controlled biological process using surrogate mothers. What happens next sounds even less like ancient mythology and more like a modern medical or scientific procedure. There's a specified gestation period. The text doesn't give the exact length, but it makes clear there's a waiting period, time for the implanted material to develop in the divine wombs. The birth goddesses remain in their chambers. The other gods wait with anticipation and perhaps anxiety about whether this unprecedented experiment will succeed. And then, after the designated time has passed, Nintu emerges from the chamber and announces success with what sounds almost like a doctor, announcing a successful delivery. The first humans are born. 7 males, 7 females, created to be workers, designed specifically to bear the burden the gods no longer wanted. Manufactured, the text is explicit about this, to assume the drudgery of the god. We were made to be slaves. The text doesn't shy away from this uncomfortable truth. It states it plainly, repeatedly. Man was created for a purpose, and that purpose was servitude. The gods celebrate. They hold a feast to honour Enki's wisdom and Nintu's skill. The labour problem is solved. The Igigi are relieved of their burdensome work, the first humans are put to their designated tasks, and they perform adequately. The system seems to be working, the experiment appears to be a success. But here's where the story becomes strange, where the carefully preserved record starts to show cracks and complications, because this first creation, this initial attempt at making humanity described in the Atrahasis, isn't presented as the final word. It's barely the beginning. And what comes next in the broader mythological corpus is where mainstream scholarship grows uncomfortable, where the ancient texts hint at something far more complex and far more disturbing than simple one-time divine creation. There's another text, equally ancient, that tells a different and darker story. It's called Enki and Ninmah, and it reads less like triumphant success story and more like the classified appendix that was never meant to be made public. The behind-the-scenes documentary of what happened in the laboratory when the experiments went wrong. The troubleshooting log. The failed prototype documentation that got filed away because it complicated the official narrative. The Enki and Ninmah text was found on tablets from Nippur, one of the oldest and most important Sumerian cities, a major religious centre. The text dates to the early 2nd millennium BCE, making it roughly contemporary with the Atrahasis. But while the Atrahasis tells the story of ultimate success, the creation of functional humanity, Enki and Ninmah tells the story of what happened during development. The trial and error, the models that didn't work, the beings that had to be discarded or repurposed. The text opens with the same basic setup we've already encountered. The gods are labouring, they're exhausted and resentful. Enki proposes creating humans to take over the work. The divine council agrees. The creation proceeds successfully, at least initially. The first humans are made and they function well enough. The gods celebrate this achievement with a feast, as gods do. Abundant food, flowing beer, music and celebration. But then something happens that doesn't appear in the sanitized version of the Atrahasis. A contest develops, a challenge, a test of skill and power between Enki and Ninmah. After the successful creation of the first humans, as the feast continues and the beer flows freely, Enki and Ninmah both drink too much. They're elated with their achievement, they're proud of their collaborative success, but excessive pride and alcohol, even among gods, leads to poor decisions and rivalry. Ninmah, emboldened by beer and divine arrogance, makes a declaration that sounds like a boast, like a challenge. She declares that she as the birth goddess, as the creator of form, holds ultimate power over human fate. She can make humans good or bad, whole or broken, successful or cursed, healthy or diseased, and it's all according to her will. Her power over creation is absolute. Enki, stung by this assertion, his own pride wounded, fires back with his own counterclaim. Whatever fate you decree, whatever form you create, no matter how broken or flawed, I can find a purpose for it. I can take even your worst failure, your most defective creation, and turn it into something useful. My wisdom is greater than your creative power. Challenge accepted. Ninmah, drunk on beer and divine pride, decides to prove her point through demonstration. She will create beings so flawed, so broken, so fundamentally dysfunctional, that even Enki's vaunted wisdom cannot save them or make them useful. She begins to create deliberately defective prototypes, each one more problematic than the last. The text lists them with clinical, almost medical precision. First, she creates a man who cannot stretch out his hands, who cannot grasp things. His hands are paralyzed, frozen, useless. He can't hold tools, he can't feed himself properly. In ancient society, this would seem like a completely disqualifying condition for any useful purpose. But Enki examines this being without hesitation and immediately assigns him the specific role. You'll serve the king directly, Enki decrees. You can't steal because you can't grasp items. You can't raise your hand in violence. You're the perfect attendant for a paranoid ruler who values absolute loyalty and physical harmlessness over capability. Your disability becomes your qualification. Second, Ninmah creates a blind man. No sight, no ability to navigate the world independently, No capacity for tasks requiring vision. Surely this one is beyond redemption, beyond useful employment. But again Enki doesn't hesitate. This being has lost one sense, he observes, but the other senses will compensate, will sharpen. You have the gift of music, Enki declares. Your hearing is more acute than the sighted. You'll be a singer, a minstrel to the king. Your voice will bring joy and your other senses will guide you. Your blindness is not a flaw but a different way of being. Third, Ninmah creates another being with crippled feet. The text is damaged here, fragmentary, so we don't have all the details of this creation. But Enki again finds employment suitable to the condition. Perhaps as a craftsman who works sitting down, the text suggests. A silversmith or jeweller, occupations requiring fine manual dexterity and keen eyesight, but not the ability to walk. The legs are irrelevant if the hands and eyes function perfectly. Fourth, a man who cannot control his bodily functions. He's incontinent, unable to hold back urine or semen. A condition that would make him a social pariah, unsuitable for any position in civilized society. This should be a disaster, a being completely unfit for integration. But Enki performs what the text calls magic, though we might call it medical treatment. A ritual bath drives out the Namtar demon from the man's body, the disease or malfunction causing his condition. He's cured, made whole, and thus made useful. Fifth, a woman who cannot bear children. Barren, infertile, in a society where a woman's primary value is tied to fertility, to the production of children, to the continuation of family lines, this should render her worthless, purposeless. But Enki doesn't see it that way. He assigns her to the queen's household. She'll be a weaver, her hands creating fabric instead of her womb creating life. Or perhaps a temple priestess, one of the sacred women consecrated to serve the gods instead of producing children for mortal men. Her infertility doesn't diminish her value, it redirects it. Sixth, and this is where the text becomes truly fascinating from an anthropological perspective, Ninmah creates a being without male or female genitalia. The text calls this being a sagar-sag, which translates roughly as eunuch, but seems to describe someone born without sexual characteristics rather than someone surgically altered. A person of no gender, no biological sex, occupying a third category that shouldn't exist in a simple binary system. And remarkably, shockingly for a text from the ancient Near East, Enki doesn't reject this creation as an abomination or mistake. He gives this genderless being a place, a position of honor even, before the king, a position of trust and sacred service. The text validates this third gender, acknowledges it as a legitimate category of being, centuries before modern discussions of gender identity and expression. 6 times Ninmah has tried to create something so broken, so fundamentally flawed, that even Enki's legendary wisdom cannot give it purpose or place in society. 6 times she has failed to stump him. Enki has countered every defect, found a role for every flaw, demonstrated that disability is not the same as worthlessness, that different doesn't mean useless. Defeated in her challenge, frustrated by her inability to create something beyond Enki's capacity to remediate, Ninmah throws her clay to the ground in anger, a gesture of surrender and rage. But Enki, vindicated in his claim of superior wisdom, isn't finished with the contest. Now it's his turn. If you want to see true impossibility, he tells her with cruel satisfaction, watch this. Let me show you something even you, great birth goddess, cannot fix. He retrieves the discarded clay from the ground and begins to mould. What he creates next is described as an ummul, a word whose meaning is debated by scholars but appears to mean something like prematurely born or incompletely formed or fundamentally broken at a level that precludes normal life. The text description is fragmentary but horrifying. It's a being that cannot speak, cannot eat, cannot move properly, cannot even lie down comfortably. Some translations suggest it cannot control its head, that its neck is too weak to support its skull. This isn't just disability. This isn't a specific impairment that could be worked around or compensated for. This is a creature existing in a state that the text itself describes as neither fully alive nor dead, trapped in some grey zone of minimal existence, unable to interact with the world in any meaningful way. Enki presents this creation to Ninmah with his challenge. Now you give this one a fate. You find a purpose for this being. Make it useful, give it a life worth living as I did for all 6 of your failed creations. Show me your power as birth goddess and mother of all. Ninmah tries. The text is clear that she makes genuine effort. She attempts to feed the Umul, but it cannot swallow. She tries to communicate, but it cannot respond, cannot even indicate if it understands. She tries to give it any kind of dignified existence, any quality of life at all, but fails completely. Finally, in despair and rage, she admits defeat. This being, she declares, is neither alive nor dead. It exists in a state I cannot remedy. It is beyond my power to help. The text ends with Enki's victory being proclaimed to the assembled gods, and Ninmah acknowledging that she cannot rival the great Lord Enki. But she also, in some versions, levels a curse at him for creating something so cruel, so fundamentally broken that even divine power cannot save it. The act of creating the Umul is presented as almost sadistic, a demonstration of raw creative power, without the wisdom or compassion to consider whether something should be created just because it can be. Now, mainstream scholars interpret this entire myth, this contest between Enki and Ninmah, as an ancient Mesopotamian way of explaining and processing human disability and deformity. It's theodicy, they say, a justification for suffering. The myth provides both explanation and social prescription. It explains why some people are born with conditions that make life difficult. It's part of divine contests and demonstrations of power. And it prescribes social response. Even the disabled have purpose, should be integrated into society in roles appropriate to their capabilities. This is a compassionate reading, even progressive for its time and hours, acknowledging human diversity and arguing for inclusion. And this interpretation may be entirely correct. The ancient Sumerians certainly did need frameworks for understanding disability, did need to integrate people with various impairments into their social structure. This myth could absolutely be serving that function. But there's another way to read this text, a way that's more literal, more disturbing. What if the Enki and Ninmah myth isn't explaining human disability in an already established species? What if it's documenting the actual trial and error process of creating that species in the first place? What if these weren't metaphors for birth defects but descriptions of failed prototypes, experimental models that didn't meet specifications, iterations in a development process? Consider the structure. This isn't framed as ongoing natural variation in an existing population. It's framed as a discrete creation event, a manufacturing process where specific beings are made one at a time, examined, evaluated, and either assigned purpose or discarded. The language is systematic. The failures are catalogued methodically. Each defect is noted. Each attempt at remediation is described. This reads less like mythological allegory and more like quality control documentation, like troubleshooting notes from an engineering project. And here's what makes it truly unnerving when you step back and look at the broader pattern. This isn't the only culture with a story like this. This motif of multiple failed creation attempts before achieving success appears across civilizations that supposedly had no contact with each other. Across the Atlantic Ocean, an ocean that was supposedly an impenetrable barrier to ancient peoples, in Mesoamerica, the Mayan creation text called the Popol Vuh tells a remarkably disturbingly similar story. The Mayan gods, according to the Popol Vuh, try multiple times to create humans. The first attempt uses mud, the same basic material as the Mesopotamian clay. The beings they create are formless, unable to hold shape. They cannot stand upright. Their features melt and dissolve like clay left in water. They have no strength, no coherent form, complete failure. The mudmen are dissolved back into the earth, unmade as failures. The second attempt uses wood. These beings are an improvement. They can stand, can walk, can speak after a fashion. They have structure, permanence, but they have no intelligence, no souls, no inner life. They cannot worship their creators or even recognize them as creators. They're essentially organic automatons, biological robots going through motions but lacking any true awareness or consciousness. The gods decide these wooden people are also failures, though more sophisticated failures than the mudmen. A great flood is sent to destroy them, though some survive and become, according to the myth, the monkeys in the forests, a haunting suggestion that failed human prototypes might persist as something else. The third attempt uses corn maize, the sacred crop of Mesoamerica. Finally, the gods achieve success. These corn people are perfect, perhaps too perfect. They have godlike vision, can see everything. Godlike understanding, can know everything. They are so capable that the gods themselves become frightened by their own creation's power. What if these perfect humans become rivals? What if they challenge divine authority? So the gods deliberately intervene a third time, not to create but to limit. They cloud the corn people's vision, reduce their capabilities, make them more manageable. They engineer in limitations. Only after this modification, this downgrade, are the gods satisfied. Success, but only after deliberately constraining the creation's potential. The parallels with the Mesopotamian tradition are striking and unsettling. Two completely separate cultures, separated by thousands of miles of ocean and presumably no contact whatsoever. Both preserve stories of multiple failed creation attempts before success. Both describe beings made from wrong materials, with wrong properties, who had to be destroyed or modified. Both explicitly state the problem. Creating workers or worshippers who actually function as intended requires multiple iterations, requires failure and learning. The Popol Vuh explicitly states we have already tried with our first works, our first creatures, but we could not get them to praise and venerate us. It's the exact same motivation, the exact same problem that drives the Mesopotamian creation accounts. The gods need servants, need workers or worshippers, but creating beings who fulfill that function properly requires experimentation, requires trial and error, requires failures. This convergence of similar narratives across cultures without contact is one of the great unsolved puzzles of comparative mythology. The standard academic explanation is that certain themes are universal to human experience. All cultures wonder about their origins. All cultures develop creation myths. Certain motifs recur because they reflect common psychological patterns or common challenges in moving from hunter-gatherer to agricultural societies. But the specificities troubles that neat explanation. We're not talking about vague similarities. We're talking about nearly identical narrative structures, multiple creation attempts, wrong materials leading to failure, beings destroyed and replaced, success only after modification and learning from previous errors. That level of detail, that particular sequence, appearing in both Mesopotamia and Mesoamerica, suggests either remarkable coincidence or something else. Either both cultures independently developed extremely similar fictional narratives about creation, or both are describing, through their available cultural and linguistic frameworks, something real that happened, an actual event or process that got encoded into mythology across the globe. Now let's step out of mythology entirely for a moment and into something harder to dismiss with appeals to cultural archetypes and psychological patterns. Let's step into geology, into archaeology, into the physical record of the Earth itself. Because if there really was a first attempt at humanity, a prototype version that was judged unsuccessful and needed to be erased before a second attempt could be made, we should see evidence of it. We should see a discontinuity in the record, a sharp break. A sudden catastrophic event that wiped the slate clean, killed off the first version, and allowed for a second attempt with a refined design based on lessons learned from the first failure. And that's exactly what we find, preserved in multiple independent lines of evidence that all converge on a single time period, approximately 12,800 years ago. The Earth experienced something catastrophic. The evidence is global in distribution, synchronous in timing, and undeniable in impact. It coincides almost exactly with several dramatic transitions. The sudden appearance of agriculture independently in multiple locations around the world, the establishment of the first permanent settled communities, the beginning of monumental architecture, and according to some genetic evidence, a dramatic shift in human population size and structure. The event is called the Younger Dryas, named after an Arctic wildflower, Dryas octopetala, whose pollen suddenly appears in sediment layers marking this period, indicating a rapid shift to much colder conditions. For thousands of years prior, Earth had been warming steadily, emerging from the grip of the last ice age. Glaciers were retreating northward. Sea levels were rising as ice melted. The climate was stabilizing into conditions favorable for complex life. The planet was transitioning into what should have been the Holocene, our current geological epoch of stable, warm conditions. And then, 12,800 years ago, without any warning, without any gradual lead-up that might have allowed preparation or adaptation, temperatures plunged catastrophically. In some regions of the northern hemisphere, average temperatures dropped by 15 degrees Celsius in less than a decade, possibly in less than a human lifetime, maybe even faster. Imagine winter arriving and never fully ending, year after year, the brief summers getting shorter and colder until they barely arrive at all. The world was thrown back into near glacial conditions with stunning speed. This cold snap, this climate disaster lasted for 1,200 years. 12 centuries of bitter cold, failed harvests, advancing ice, ecological collapse. And then, as abruptly as it began, it ended. Around 11,600 years ago, temperatures shot back up with equal dramatic speed. The climate recovered, the ice retreated again, and interestingly, very interestingly, human civilization suddenly exploded into existence in its wake. For decades, the conventional explanation among geologists and climatologists was straightforward and required no appeals to catastrophism, no dramatic events, nothing that violated the principle of uniformitarianism that dominated geology since the 19th century. The explanation went like this. Glacial meltwater from massive Ice Age lakes in North America, particularly the enormous Lake Agassiz, which at its maximum extent covered more area than all the current Great Lakes combined, catastrophically broke through ice dams that had been containing it. This released a tremendous volume of fresh water into the North Atlantic Ocean. This sudden massive influx of fresh water, being less dense than salt water, formed a lid over the North Atlantic, disrupting the ocean's thermohaline circulation, the great conveyor belt of currents that distributes heat around the planet driven by temperature and salinity differences. The circulation shut down. Without this heat distribution system operating, the northern hemisphere froze. Eventually, over centuries, the fresh water mixed sufficiently, the salinity balance restored, the circulation system restarted, and warmth returned. It's a neat explanation. It fits the uniformitarian principle that geological changes happen gradually through processes we can observe today. It requires no exotic causes, and it might even be partially true, part of the full explanation, but it doesn't explain everything. It doesn't explain, for instance, the platinum. In 2013, a research team led by Professor Francis Thackeray at the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, South Africa, made a discovery that complicated the simple meltwater hypothesis considerably. Working at a site called Wonder Crater in the Limpopo province, they were analysing sediment cores, layers of accumulated material laid down over thousands of years, when they found something anomalous. In a thin layer dating to exactly 12,800 years ago, right at the Younger Dryas boundary, they found a dramatic spike in platinum concentration. This matters because platinum is extremely rare in Earth's crust. It occurs naturally only in trace amounts, parts per billion in most rocks and sediments. You don't get sudden spikes in platinum from normal geological or climate processes. But platinum is common, relatively speaking, in asteroids and comets. It's a calling card, a signature, evidence of extraterrestrial material. A platinum spike in a precisely dated geological layer suggests only one thing: impact. One spike could be coincidence, a local anomaly, contamination, a measurement error. But the Wonder Crater spike wasn't alone. As more teams heard about this discovery and started looking, the same platinum anomaly began appearing everywhere. Greenland ice cores, sediment layers across North America, sites throughout Europe, multiple locations in Asia. The pattern is global. The timing is synchronous within the limits of radiocarbon dating precision, and it's always concentrated in a thin boundary layer that corresponds to the onset of the Younger Dryas. This is when the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis enters the scientific conversation, and with it a fierce debate that continues to this day. First formally proposed in 2007 by a team including physicist Richard Firestone, geologist Alan West, and about 20 other scientists from various disciplines, the hypothesis suggests that Earth didn't just experience a dramatic climate change 12,800 years ago. It was struck by fragments of a disintegrating comet, and that cosmic impact triggered the climate catastrophe. Not a single. Massive asteroid impact that would leave an obvious crater like Chicxulub in Mexico from the dinosaur killing event. Instead, an airburst event, or more likely multiple airbursts. Imagine a large comet, perhaps 100 kilometers in diameter, approaching Earth and beginning to fragment as it enters the atmosphere. The fragments, still travelling at cosmic velocities, heat up from atmospheric friction and explode in massive air bursts before reaching the surface. Think of the Tunguska event in Siberia from 1908, where a meteor or comet fragment exploded in the air, leaving no crater but devastating an area of 800 square miles, flattening 80 million trees in a radial pattern from a central point. Now imagine not one Tunguska but thousands scattered across North America, Europe and Asia, all happening within days or weeks. The explosions would have been beyond anything in recorded human history, releasing energy equivalent to millions of megatons of TNT. The scale of destruction would have been biblical, literally, since the biblical flood accounts might be cultural memories of exactly this kind of event. The evidence for this impact hypothesis has been building steadily despite fierce resistance from portions of the scientific establishment. Research published in the journal Airbursts and Cratering Impacts in 2004, authored by a team led by UC Santa Barbara Professor Emeritus James Kennett, documented the presence of shocked quartz in sediments from 3 separate sites, New Jersey, Maryland and South Carolina, all on the eastern coast of North America. These sediment samples all date precisely to the Younger Dryas boundary layer. Shocked quartz matters because it's quartz that's been subjected to such intense pressure that its crystal structure deforms at the molecular level, creating distinctive patterns called lamellae, parallel or intersecting lines of stress fractures visible under microscopic examination. This is not something that happens through normal geological processes. The pressures required are found in only 2 scenarios: nuclear explosions or cosmic impacts. Kennett's team did something clever to verify their interpretation. They compared the shocked quartz from these North American sites to quartz from known impact events. The Trinity nuclear test site in New Mexico, where the first atomic bomb was detonated in 1945, and nuclear test sites in Kazakhstan from Soviet weapons testing in the 1950s. The patterns matched. The same types of subplanar and subparallel deformations, indicating lower pressure airbursts rather than direct surface impacts that would create different, more intense shock patterns. Then there's the melt glass. Tiny spherules of rock and metal that have been flash heated to temperatures exceeding 2000 degrees Celsius, hot enough to melt quartz, which has one of the highest melting points of common minerals. These spherules contain a distinctive mixture, mostly terrestrial material, the stuff of Earth, but with traces of extraterrestrial composition mixed in. They represent the moment of impact, when cosmic material and terrestrial material were both vaporized, mixed in the fireball, and then cooled rapidly into these tiny glass beads. Melt glass has been found in the Younger Dryas boundary layer at sites across North America, in Europe, and most recently and significantly, in ocean sediment cores from Baffin Bay between Canada and Greenland, published in 2005. The ocean cores are particularly important because they eliminate concerns about terrestrial contamination. Anything deposited on the ocean floor comes from above, settles through the water column, and gets preserved in the deep sediments. Finding impact proxies in ocean cores is as close to a smoking gun as you can get. And then there are the nanodiamonds. Microscopic diamonds, invisible to the naked eye, that only form under extreme combinations of pressure and temperature, exactly the conditions that occur during high-velocity impacts or airbursts. Standard geological processes don't create nanodiamonds. You need shock, heat and carbon all coming together in a moment of extraordinary violence. Nanodiamonds have been found in Greenland ice cores in layers dating to the Younger Dryas boundary. They've been found at dozens of terrestrial sites across 4 continents, and recently they've been found in those same ocean sediment cores from Baffin Bay. The metallic particles extracted from these ocean cores show chemical compositions consistent with cometry material. Iron with unusually low oxygen content and high nickel content, ratios that don't match terrestrial rocks. Put it all together, synthesize all these different lines of evidence, the platinum spikes, the shocked quartz, the melt glass spherules, the nanodiamonds, the magnetic microspherules, the elevated levels of other impact-associated elements like iridium, and a picture emerges. Picture of devastation on a scale almost impossible to comprehend from our modern safe perspective. Comet fragments, potentially thousands of them, from a massive progenitor comet that broke apart screaming through Earth's atmosphere at hypersonic speeds, heating up from atmospheric friction until they reach the point of catastrophic explosive decompression. Air bursts of unimaginable power occurring across the northern hemisphere. The pressure waves alone would flatten forests for hundreds of miles in every direction from each burst point. The heat would ignite everything combustible. A study published in the Journal of Geology in 2019 estimated, based on charcoal deposits and burn markers in archaeological sites, that approximately 30 million square miles of Earth's surface burned during this period. That's roughly 10% of the planet's total land biomass going up in flames in what might have been a matter of days or weeks. Continental-scale firestorms, the sky filling with smoke and ash and soot. The sun blocked out, dimmed to an orange glow, or vanishing entirely behind the pall of debris. Temperatures plummeting as an impact winter set in. The same process that likely killed the dinosaurs 66 million years ago, but happening to a world that already had humans struggling to survive. The smoke and ash blocking sunlight, preventing photosynthesis, collapsing food chains from the bottom up. But the comet didn't just bring fire and darkness. It brought water, a tremendous amount of water, though not from the comet itself. The fragments impacted primarily in the northern hemisphere, and many struck the Laurentide ice sheet, a vast dome of ice covering most of Canada and parts of the northern United States, up to 2 miles thick in places, containing more frozen water than currently exists in all of Antarctica. Imagine comet fragments, travelling at tens of kilometres per second, punching through miles of ice. The kinetic energy converting instantly to heat, massive amounts of ice flash melting, entire lakes, seas worth of meltwater being created in moments, in seconds. This sudden, catastrophic release of meltwater is what actually disrupted the Atlantic circulation and caused the climate to crash into the deep freeze. But the effects went far beyond the immediate impact zone. Geological evidence from 3 separate, relatively isolated ice masses shows they all began to destabilize simultaneously at the Younger Dryas' onset. The Laurentide ice sheet in North America started collapsing catastrophically, releasing enormous meltwater floods. The Fennoscandian ice sheet in northern Europe began destabilizing. The Greenland ice sheet margins started retreating rapidly. 3 different ice masses separated by thousands of miles of ocean, all reacting at the same time. This synchronicity is difficult, perhaps impossible to explain through conventional climate mechanisms alone. Climate changes propagate, they spread, they take time. But a cosmic impact explains it perfectly. The trauma concentrated in the northern hemisphere, the heat from thousands of airbursts, the pressure waves, all hitting at the same time, all concentrated in the latitudes where these ice sheets existed. The world caught fire and then immediately froze. It's almost poetic in its horror. Except it wasn't poetry. It was physics. It was geology. It happened. What happened to the life on Earth during this period is written clearly in the extinction record, preserved in the layers of bone and ash. The megafauna, the giant mammals that had survived the Ice Age for hundreds of thousands of years, that had coexisted with humans for tens of thousands of years. Years suddenly vanished, not gradually, not over thousands of years, abruptly, at the Younger Dryas boundary. In North America, the casualties read like a mythical bestiary. Woolly mammoths, those iconic Ice Age survivors, mastodons, their forest-dwelling cousins, saber-toothed cats, apex predators, giant ground sloths, some species as large as elephants, dire wolves larger and more powerful than any modern wolf, short-faced bears, the largest land predators to have existed in North America, standing 12 feet tall when reared up, ancient horses and camels, yes, both native to North America before their extinction. Giant beavers the size of black bears. The extinction rate was catastrophic. Over 70% of large mammal species in North America went extinct at the Younger Dryas boundary. Paleontologists can track this in the fossil record with unsettling precision. Below the boundary layer, abundant megafauna bones. At the boundary, the black mat layer marking the catastrophe heavily burned remains, and above the boundary almost nothing. The megafauna just stop. In South America, similar devastation, though slightly less complete. In Europe, massive die-offs of mammoth populations, cave bears, woolly rhinoceros. Even in South Africa, which was not directly in the Northern Hemisphere impact zone, several extraordinary megafauna species disappeared around this same time period. Giant African buffalo, large extinct zebra, a massive species of wildebeest, all gone, and humans. This is where it becomes personal, where the catastrophe stops being an abstract geological event and becomes part of our story. The Clovis culture, the dominant Paleo-Indian culture of North America, named for the distinctive stone points they manufactured, vanishes from the archaeological record at the Younger Dryas boundary. Just stops. Dozens of known Clovis sites and then suddenly no more. The technology, sophisticated for its time, disappears. The sites that show Clovis occupation and then above the boundary layer show no occupation at all for generations. The whole culture, an entire technological and social complex that had spread across the continent, gone. And fascinatingly, troublingly, at the exact same time on the other side of the Atlantic, archaeologists have detected the termination of the Robberg stone artifact industry in South Africa. Different continent, different people, different technology, but the same sudden disappearance at the same time marker in the geological record. Population geneticists working backward from modern DNA have calculated that human numbers globally may have dropped during this period to as few as 10,000 individuals. Some estimates go even lower, suggesting perhaps 3,000 to 5,000 people survived globally. We came terrifyingly close to extinction, closer than most people realize. The survivors, scattered in isolated pockets, in refugia where conditions remain just barely survivable, would have faced a nightmare world. The vast herds of megafauna they had relied on for food wiped out. The forests and grasslands they gathered plants from burned to ash. The climate unstable and deadly, swinging between extreme cold and brief periods of warmth. The sky itself had rained down fire and destruction. Everything they had known was gone, and they had no framework to understand why. No knowledge of comets or atmospheric physics or impact dynamics. All they knew was that the world had ended, that the gods had sent destruction, that they had somehow survived when almost everyone else had died. The trauma of that survival must have been overwhelming, branded into their collective consciousness. Except maybe, just maybe, they did have a framework. Maybe this is where the flood myths come from. Not metaphorical floods representing gradual change, not symbolic narratives about moral cleansing, but the actual catastrophic reality of continent-spanning walls of water released when cosmic impacts melted ice sheets. Real floods, real destruction, real survival. The Sumerian flood narrative in the Atrahasis. The biblical deluge survived by Noah, the Greek flood of Deucalion and Pyrrha. The Hindu flood survived by Manu with the help of Matsya. The Chinese flood mythology of Gin and Yu. The Mesoamerican flood stories in the Popol Vuh. Over 500 separate flood myths from cultures around the world collected by comparative mythologists, and they all describe the same basic elements. A warning from gods or a god that destruction is coming. Often the warning goes to one righteous or wise individual, instructions to build a boat of specific dimensions, a catastrophic flood that covers the earth. Almost all humanity drowned. A small group of survivors, often animals saved too. A bird sent out to test for dry land. The boat landing on a mountain, a sacrifice made after survival, a covenant or promise from the divine. The world beginning again from the survivors. The consistency is remarkable. If these were independent inventions, purely fictional narratives created to explain local flooding or serve theological purposes, you'd expect much more variation. But instead, you get the same story beats in the same order with the same outcome. Told from Ireland to India to the Americas. Maybe they're all describing the same event. Maybe 12,800 years ago, when the comet struck and the ice sheets collapsed and the world caught fire and then froze. Maybe the few thousand human survivors scattered across the globe, separated by vast distances and unable to communicate, all experienced the same catastrophe and all preserved the memory the same way. as a story of total destruction, a flood, and a handful of survivors chosen or lucky. In the Atrahasis epic, there's a chilling detail that modern readers often overlook, because it seems like a minor plot point. After the flood has receded, after Atrahasis, the survivor has made his sacrifice and the gods have gathered like flies around the sweet-smelling smoke because they're starving. Having been without their human servants and their offerings for days, there's a negotiation. Enlil, the stern god who sent the flood specifically to eliminate the noisy, troublesome human population, is furious that anyone survived. His plan for peace and quiet has been ruined, but Enki, who warned Atrahasis and saved humanity, argues for a different approach going forward. Don't destroy them completely again, he says, but we need better population controls this time. We need to build in limitations. So they reach an agreement. Humanity can continue, can rebuild, but with new limitations, new controls hard-coded into the species. The text is explicit about what these controls are. From now on, 1/3 of children will die in infancy. There will be women who cannot bear children, barrenness built into some bloodlines. There will be demons who snatch infants from the womb, causing miscarriages. There will be priestesses consecrated to the gods who must remain celibate, removing themselves from reproduction. It's a systematic plan for managing human population growth through infertility, infant mortality, and institutionalized celibacy. It sounds less like mythology and more like breeding program adjustment, more like species modification, more like genetic engineering of second-generation humanity after learning the lessons from the first version that became too numerous, too noisy, too problematic. And here's what's disturbing when you connect this to modern genetics. If the Younger Dryas impact really happened, if it really did nearly wipe out humanity, reducing our population to perhaps 5,000 to 10,000 individuals scattered in isolated refugia, then the survivors, the founding population of all modern humans, would have gone through what geneticists call an extreme bottleneck. When populations crash to tiny numbers and then rebuild, you lose genetic diversity. Rare alleles disappear. Traits that were uncommon in the larger pre-bottleneck population can become fixed in the survivors through random chance, through what's called genetic drift. The genetic structure of the post-bottleneck population is fundamentally different from the pre-bottleneck population. And we see evidence of exactly this in modern human genetics. Studies of mitochondrial DNA, which is passed exclusively through the maternal line and doesn't recombine, allowing geneticists to trace ancestry with precision, show that all modern humans descend from a remarkably small population of women who lived around 15,000 years ago, right at the edge of the Younger Dryas. The mitochondrial Eve, though she's not a single person, but rather a population of closely related women, dates to this period. The Y chromosome data tracking paternal lineages shows a similar severe bottleneck at roughly the same time. We're all descended from a tiny group of survivors. We are, in a very real genetic sense, a reset species. The second attempt, Humanity 2.0, built from the remnants of Humanity 1.0 that barely survived the cosmic catastrophe. But here's where it starts to sound less like natural selection acting on random variation and more like intervention, like guided modification. Because what happens immediately after the Younger Dryas, once the climate finally stabilizes around 10,000 years ago, isn't gradual recovery. It's explosion. It's unprecedented, unexplained rapid development of complex civilization. Around 10,000 years ago, as the climate warms and stabilizes and the world becomes habitable again, something unprecedented happens. Agriculture appears. Not in one place, slowly developing and then spreading, but in multiple locations around the world, almost simultaneously in geological terms, independently discovered or perhaps independently taught. The Fertile Crescent in Mesopotamia, where wheat and barley are domesticated. The Yellow River Valley in China, where millet and rice are cultivated. Mesoamerica, where maize, beans and potash are developed into the Three Sisters. The Andes in South America, where potatoes and quinoa are domesticated. The New Guinea highlands, where taro and yams are cultivated. Sub-Saharan Africa, where sorghum and African rice are grown. Independent centres of plant and animal domestication, all emerging within a few thousand years of each other, a blink of an eye in archaeological time. For hundreds of thousands of years, anatomically modern humans had been hunter-gatherers. The same basic lifestyle for 10,000 generations. Then suddenly, within the space of maybe 300 generations, completely separate populations on different continents, some with no contact at all figure out farming. They all independently develop complex societies, architecture, art, pottery, weaving, social hierarchies, trade networks spanning hundreds or thousands of miles, writing systems to record their transactions and their stories. The Sumerians build their first cities around 4500 BCE. Within 1500 years, they have everything. Cuneiform writing, one of the first writing systems in the world. The wheel, revolutionizing transport and pottery making. The plough, transforming agriculture. Complex irrigation systems that turn desert into fertile farmland. Ziggurats reaching toward the heavens. Massive stepped pyramids serving as temples. Astronomical tables predicting lunar eclipses, planetary movements, tracking Venus with precision. Mathematics sophisticated enough for complex accounting, geometry, early algebra is not gradual, it's explosive. It's a civilizational big bang emerging from groups that, according to mainstream understanding, should still be struggling with basic subsistence. The standard explanation is that climate stabilization after the Younger Dryas created favorable conditions for agriculture. Once one group figured out farming, the knowledge and techniques spread through trade and cultural contact. Population growth from reliable food supplies allowed for specialization of labor. Some people could be full-time craftsmen, priests, scribes, rulers, instead of everyone doing subsistence food procurement. Civilization emerged naturally from these favorable conditions and agricultural surplus. But the genetics don't entirely support slow diffusion and cultural transmission. The archaeological record doesn't show gradual development. It's punctuated. It's sudden, almost like someone flipped a switch or someone intervened at specific moments and places. Here's the dark speculation, the unsettling alternative interpretation that hovers around all this evidence like a ghost. What if the Younger Dryas wasn't just a cosmic accident? What if it was a reset, a deliberate erasure of the first version of humanity, the prototypes described in Enki and Ninmah, the flawed early attempts that weren't quite right, that had become too numerous, too independent, too chaotic? Think about the logic in the Mesopotamian texts. The Anunnaki create humans. The humans multiply rapidly, faster than intended. They become too numerous, too noisy, too problematic, too difficult to control. Enlil, the stern commander, wants to eliminate them. He tries various methods: plague, drought, famine, but Enki, protective of his creation, helps humans survive each attempt. Finally, Enlil proposes the ultimate solution, a flood to wipe them all out, to hit the reset button. But Enki, always the protector, the one god who consistently sides with humanity in these myths, warns one man, Atrahasis, whose name means exceedingly wise. Build a boat, save yourself and your family, preserve the seed of all living things, and after the flood, after the reset, they try again, but this time with modifications, this time with built-in population controls, this time with limitations that will prevent the problems that emerged in version 1. What if that's not mythological fiction? What if that's a literal, though culturally filtered and technologically misunderstood, description of a species development program that involved trial, failure, catastrophic elimination through natural or engineered means, and redesign based on lessons learned? The Atrahasis states explicitly that humans after the flood are different from humans before. They're less fertile, 1/3 of births failing. They're more vulnerable to disease, they die younger. They're easier to manage and control. The Sumerian king list, that fascinating document we touched on earlier, shows this transition perfectly. Before the flood, the king list records rulers with impossibly long reigns, 28 to 800 years, 36,000 years, 43 to 200 years. Mainstream scholars interpret these as purely mythological, symbolic, numbers indicating divine or semi-divine status, not actual chronological time. But what if they're using a different timescale? What if these numbers refer to something else? Not Earth years, but Nibiruan years on a 300-year orbital cycle, making the reigns more plausible. Or what if they represent something else entirely? Genetic generations, population cycles, something we don't yet understand. After the flood, the king list shows reign lengths dropping dramatically, first to thousands of years, still impossible by our standards, then to hundreds, then eventually to numbers that become almost plausible, that match known historical records. The text itself marks this transition explicitly. After the flood swept over, when the kingship was lowered from heaven, the kingship was in Kish, lowered from heaven, as if something was reinstalled, rebooted, reset with new parameters. And if you really want to push into maximally uncomfortable speculative territory, consider the possibility raised by ancient astronaut theorists, controversial researchers like Zecharia Sitchin and his successors. What if the global elite, the royal bloodlines that suddenly appear in every emerging civilization claiming divine descent, aren't speaking metaphorically? What if the Anunnaki really did seed certain bloodlines after the reset? Created hybrid dynasties mixing divine or advanced non-human genetics with the modified human base model, establishing a ruling class that would maintain their social structures and continue the extraction of resources, gold according to Sitchin, even in their absence. The Sumerian kings claimed direct descent from the gods. The Egyptian pharaohs insisted they were living gods, Horus incarnate. The Chinese emperors held the mandate of heaven. European monarchies claimed divine right. Every major civilization had a ruling class that justified its power through claims of divine ancestry or divine selection. What if those weren't metaphors for legitimacy? What if they were statements of literal genetic truth, hybrid bloodlines designed to rule? Conspiracy theorists run with this idea to wild extremes, pointing to secret societies, supposed Illuminati bloodlines, claims that humanity is still controlled by the descendants of the ancient gods hiding in positions of power. That's probably taking the speculation too far into unfalsifiable territory. But the kernel of the idea that our civilizations were designed, that our social structures were engineered, that we've been guided or manipulated from the beginning by something or someone with a plan, is harder to dismiss when you look at how quickly and universally those structures emerged after the Younger Dryas. Cities organized the same way across cultures. Pyramids and stepped temples built independently but following similar design principles. Trade networks spanning continents appearing with remarkable speed. Writing systems emerging in multiple locations with structural similarities. Astronomical knowledge that seems too sophisticated for the supposed level of civilization. All appearing within a few thousand years of the reset, of the catastrophe, of the bottleneck. Almost as if everyone was working from the same blueprint or receiving instruction from the same source or accessing the same ancient knowledge that survived from before the catastrophe. Which brings us to perhaps the most remarkable and troubling archaeological site in this entire puzzle, a site that shouldn't exist according to the conventional timeline of human development, Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey. Discovered in 1963 but not excavated until 1995, Göbekli Tepe is dated through radiocarbon methods to approximately 9600 BCE. Let that sink in. 9600 BCE. That's 11,600 years ago, placing its construction immediately after the Younger Dryas ended, right at the beginning of human recovery from the catastrophe. And it's not a simple site, it's architectural marvel. Massive circular enclosures, T-shaped limestone pillars, some weighing up to 16 tons, carved with intricate reliefs of animals. Foxes, lions, snakes, vultures, scorpions. These aren't crude scratches. These are sophisticated sculptures requiring advanced stoneworking tools and artistic skill. The conventional timeline says agriculture appeared around 10,000 BCE. Pottery appears around 9,000 BCE. Cities appear around 4,000 BCE. Monumental architecture of this scale and sophistication shouldn't appear till you have settled agricultural societies with labour surplus and social organisation. But Göbekli Tepe predates all of that. The people who built it, according to analysis of animal bones found at the site, were hunter-gatherers. They hunted gazelles and wild cattle. They gathered wild plants. They didn't farm. They didn't live in cities. They supposedly didn't have the social organisation or resources to build something like this. And yet they did. They quarried massive stones. They carved them with precision. They transported them to the hilltop. They erected them in complex circular arrangements aligned with astronomical phenomena. They created a ceremonial site that served as a gathering place for scattered groups across a wide region. Recent excavations have found evidence that contradicts the initial interpretation of Göbekli Tepe as purely ceremonial. There are domestic structures, areas for grain processing, rainwater collection systems. People didn't just visit for ceremonies, they lived there or nearby. They had a semi-permanent settlement at a site that predates agriculture. The site forces a reconsideration of the entire narrative of human development. For decades, the story went, agriculture leads to settlement, settlement leads to social complexity leads to monumental architecture and civilization. But Göbekli Tepe suggests the opposite sequence. Maybe gathering for religious or social purposes came first. Maybe the need to feed workers and participants in these gatherings led to intensive cultivation of wild grains. Maybe agriculture was developed to support the ceremonial site, not the other way around. Klaus Schmidt, the German archaeologist who excavated Göbekli Tepe until his death in 2014, proposed this theory. The site created the need for food surplus, which led to cultivation, which led to agriculture, which led to permanent settlement. Religion and monumental architecture drove agricultural development, not the other way around. But there's another interpretation, one that Schmidt and mainstream archaeologists reject, but that alternative researchers find compelling. What if Göbekli Tepe was built by survivors of the Younger Dryas catastrophe? People who had knowledge, skills, and organizational capacity from before the reset. What if it represents not the beginning of civilization but a remnant, a reconstruction, a recovery of lost knowledge? The animal carvings at Göbekli Tepe include species that went extinct during the Younger Dryas, megafauna that don't appear in the archaeological record after the catastrophe. Are these carvings memories of a world that was destroyed? Artistic tributes to vanished species? Or evidence that the site was begun before or during the catastrophe and continued after? Pillar 43, known as the Vulture Stone, is particularly fascinating. It shows vultures, scorpions, and what some archaeologists interpret as astronomical symbols. A scorpion that might represent the constellation Scorpius, a circle that might represent the sun, various other symbols that might map to constellations. Some researchers, notably Martin Sweatman from the University of Edinburgh, have argued that Pillar 43 is actually a star map, a memorial carved in stone commemorating the comet impact of the Younger Dryas. If that interpretation is correct, and it's hotly debated, then Göbekli Tepe isn't just a ceremonial site. It's a message from the survivors, a warning carved in stone. This happened. Remember. Don't forget that the sky can rain down destruction. After approximately 1,000 years of use, around 8000 BCE, Göbekli Tepe was deliberately buried. Not abandoned, not destroyed. Buried. The entire site was carefully filled in with tons of earth and debris, preserving it perfectly for 11,000 years. Why? Why would they deliberately bury their most important ceremonial site? The standard explanation is ritual closure, that sites were ritually terminated when their use ended. But the alternative interpretation is preservation. Maybe they buried it to hide it, to protect it, to preserve it for a future time when humanity would be ready to understand what it represents. Maybe Göbekli Tepe is a time capsule from the survivors of the first humanity, a message to the second humanity. We were here, we knew things, we survived the catastrophe, learned from what we built, and Göbekli Tepe isn't alone. Other similar sites are being discovered across southeastern Turkey and the Levant. Karahan Tepe, Nevaluchori, Jerf El Ahmar, all from the same period, all showing similar architecture and symbolism, all suggesting that immediately after the Younger Dryas, there was an explosion of monumental architecture and complex social organization that shouldn't be possible for scattered hunter-gatherer bands. Unless they weren't starting from zero, unless they were recovering, unless they had help, unless the survivors carried knowledge from before, unless, as the Sumerian texts claim, there were teachers, fish people from the sea, the Apkallam sages, beings who emerged after the flood and taught humanity the arts of civilization. Every ancient culture has this motif, teacher beings who appear after a catastrophe and give humanity knowledge. The Sumerian Abgalu, The Babylonian Oannes, described as a fishman who taught civilization. The Egyptian god Thoth, who gave writing and mathematics. The Mayan Kukulkan, the feathered serpent who taught agriculture and astronomy. The Hindu Matsya, the fish avatar who saved Manu and restored knowledge after the flood. The Greek Prometheus, who gave forbidden fire and knowledge. Are these metaphors for cultural transmission? Symbolic representations of human innovation personified? Or are they memories of something real? Actual teachers, whether survivors of pre-catastrophe humanity carrying preserved knowledge, or Anunnaki instructors returning after the reset to guide the development of version 2 or something else entirely? The deepest question, the one that genuinely keeps you up at night if you follow this rabbit hole all the way down, is whether this cycle is finished or ongoing. Are the Anunnaki coming back? Are they already here? The texts are ambiguous on this point. Some, like the later Babylonian astrology texts, suggest the gods have fully departed, withdrawn from direct involvement in human affairs, leaving us to run on our own. Others, particularly in the more apocalyptic traditions, hint at return. The Mayan calendar that caused so much panic in 2012, it was marking the end of a cycle, the completion of a Baktun. But cycles by definition are circular, they repeat. Endings are also beginnings. Nibiru, if you follow Sitchin's controversial interpretation, the supposed home planet of the Anunnaki is said to have a 3,600-year elliptical orbit that brings it periodically through the inner solar system. If you start counting from different baseline events, the flood, the teaching of civilization, the establishment of Sumerian kingship, you get different predicted return dates. Most of them are either in our recent past or near future, depending on which event you use as the starting point. But maybe the cycle isn't orbital. Maybe it's generational or technological. Maybe the Anunnaki check in periodically, not because their planet swings through on a predictable schedule, but because they decide to based on our development, or because they've been watching all along from elsewhere. The modern UFO phenomenon, the thousands of reports of craft in our skies that move in ways our physics says are impossible, right-angle tides at hypersonic speeds, transmedium travel from air to water without slowing, acceleration that should create G-forces that liquefy any biological pilot. Government acknowledgement through the 2017 New York Times disclosure and subsequent Department of Defense admissions that yes, there are objects performing maneuvers we can't explain using our current understanding of physics. Are those visitors, observers, the Anunnaki checking on their experiment? Or are we now the experiment that got away, the creation that exceeded specifications and is no longer fully under control? We split the atom, unleashing energies once reserved for stars. We mapped our own genome, reading the book of life itself. We're building artificial intelligence, creating our own created beings. We're on the verge of becoming creators ourselves, of achieving the power that was once divine. Does that make us successors to the Anunnaki? Does it make us their equals finally? Or does it make us a threat that needs to be managed or reset again? The real answer is probably much more mundane and less dramatic. We're almost certainly a species that emerged through entirely natural evolutionary processes over millions of years. The Younger Dryas was a climate disruption caused by meltwater pulses from collapsing ice sheets, possibly triggered or exacerbated by a cosmic impact but not directed or engineered by anyone. A natural catastrophe with natural causes. The myths are cultural constructs, ways for ancient people to process trauma, explain origins, and muster establish social order. The sudden emergence of civilization after the Younger Dryas is striking, but ultimately explainable through environmental factors, population recovery, and accumulated human ingenuity finally having the conditions to flourish. The genetic bottleneck is real, but results from natural population crash and recovery, not genetic engineering. These similarities between creation myths across cultures reflect either diffusion of stories through ancient trade networks we don't fully understand, or universal patterns in human psychology and culture, or both. We are alone in the universe, or at least in our local galactic neighborhood. We always have been. We made ourselves through evolutionary processes operating over deep time, and that's beautiful and meaningful in its own way. Terrifying in its implications of cosmic isolation, yes, but beautiful in suggesting that intelligence, consciousness, civilization can emerge naturally from matter and energy and time. But then you read those texts again. You look at the precision of the descriptions in Enki and Ninmah, the systematic catalogue of failures and successes. You see the global pattern of myths that shouldn't correlate but do, myths separated by oceans that shouldn't be crossable but telling the same stories in the same sequence. You examine the Younger Dryas evidence that keeps accumulating despite fierce institutional resistance, evidence that keeps suggesting impact when the establishment wants it to be meltwater and nothing more. You notice that the same scientific establishment that once told us with absolute certainty that continental drift was impossible pseudoscience, that impact craters couldn't form on Earth's surface, that meteorites were superstitious nonsense, that anthropogenic climate change was fantasy, is now telling us with equal absolute certainty that ancient astronaut theory is pseudoscience, and we should stop asking these uncomfortable questions. Maybe they're right. Probably they're right. The weight of evidence supports natural explanations for everything we've discussed, but maybe there's a reason these questions make people uncomfortable. Not because they're obviously false, but because they're difficult to falsify definitively. Because they exist in the liminal space between what we know and what we can prove. Because if we were created twice, if the first version failed and had to be erased, if we are the second attempt, the improved model but still just a product rather than the culmination of billions of years of blind evolutionary processes, then everything changes. Our religions are shattered or revealed as carefully edited truth. Our origin stories are either lies or encoded facts. Our sense of cosmic significance is simultaneously demolished. We're tools that gained consciousness and elevated. We're important enough that someone designed us. We're not special in the way we thought. We're not unique accidents. But we're also not merely random. We're products, experiments, the successful model that came after dozens of failed prototypes. And somewhere encoded in our genetic sequences, in our cellular memory, in the deepest parts of our collective unconscious that Jung mapped and named. Archetypes, we remember. We remember the laboratory. We remember the failures. We remember the flood, the fire, the destruction. We remember the teachers who came after and showed us how to build, how to write, how to count the stars, how to build ziggurats reaching toward the heavens they came from. The clay tablets preserve it in cuneiform. The myths encode it in narrative. The earth itself bears the scars in platinum spikes and shocked quartz and the sudden extinctions. The evidence is there, waiting for anyone willing to look past the comfortable narratives and ask dangerous questions. Were we made? Were we made twice? And if so, who is still watching to see if this version will finally work as intended? Or if we too, when we become too numerous, too noisy, too independent, too advanced, will need to be reset when we pose problems for our Creator's plans? You're lying here in the dark thinking about these questions now. The impossibly old texts describing what sounds like genetic engineering, the catalogue of failed prototypes, the catastrophic reset marked in geological layers, the sudden emergence of civilization from scattered survivors, the return cycle encoded in orbital mathematics or generational time, the watching gods or aliens or advanced predecessors. It all swirls together into a pattern that's either the greatest conspiracy never proven, or the most elaborate mythology ever constructed, or maybe something in between. Maybe something stranger than either fully false or fully true. Maybe the truth is that myth and history are not opposites but layers of the same thing. Different ways of encoding the same information using different frameworks and vocabularies. The Sumerians couldn't write about genes and DNA because they didn't have those words, those concepts. So they wrote about blood and clay and divine essence. They couldn't describe cosmic impacts and extinction events with scientific precision. So they wrote about angry gods and cleansing floods. They couldn't explain population bottlenecks and founder effects using genetics. So they wrote about one man in a boat and a handful of survivors and the world beginning again from almost nothing. But they were describing something real, something that happened, something so traumatic it burned itself into every culture that came after, spreading across the globe as the survivors scattered and rebuilt. The memory of a world that ended, the knowledge that we are not the first, The understanding that it could all be washed away again, reset again, rebooted with version 3 or 4 or however many times it takes to get it right. And the hope. The fragile, defiant, beautiful hope that maybe this time we'll do better. Maybe this time will be worth keeping. Maybe this time when the gods return or the comet comes or the cycle completes or whatever form the next test takes, we'll have become something our creators never imagined. Not slaves, not tools, not even hybrids, but truly human, whatever that means. Whatever that can mean when you don't know if you designed yourself or were designed. When your origin story might be true or might be mythology or might be both simultaneously. When the evidence points everywhere and nowhere. When the question of our double creation remains open, unanswered, perhaps unanswerable with our current frameworks and understanding. The night is deep now. Your breathing has slowed. The questions don't need answers tonight. They never really did. The power of these stories, these ancient accounts of creation and catastrophe and recreation, isn't in their literal truth or falsehood. It's in what they reveal about us, about our need to understand origins, about our fear that we might not be as special or as self-made as we want to believe, about our hope that somewhere, someone cares what happens to us, even if that someone created us for purposes we don't fully understand. The Sumerians pressed these stories into clay 4,000 years ago because they needed to remember. Remember the catastrophe. Remember the teachers. Remember that the world could end and begin again. Remember their own origin story, however they understood it. And we're still reading those tablets, still debating meanings, still caught between dismissing as mythology and wondering if they knew something we've forgotten or haven't yet discovered. Maybe the truth doesn't matter as much as we think. Maybe what matters is that we're here, that we survived whatever happened 12,800 years ago, whether cosmic accident or deliberate reset, that we built civilizations and wrote poetry and sent spacecraft to other planets, that we look up at stars and wonder if anyone looks back, that we carry in our genes and myths and stubborn rebellious spirits both the legacy of creation and the memory of almost being erased. We are the second attempt, or the 10th, or the only one that ever was. We are descendants of survivors. We are creators ourselves now. And the story is still being written. The Anunnaki may be gone, or watching, or may never have existed outside the imagination of ancient storytellers trying to make sense of a world they couldn't fully understand. But we exist. We are here, and that is enough. The clay remembers, the stars remember, the deep places of earth remember. And now, as sleep takes you, you'll remember too. Remember that you're part of a story stretching back to the dawn of time, a story of creation and catastrophe, of failures and triumphs, of beings who dreamed of making something in their image, and ended up making something that could dream on its own. Sleep well, dream deep, and know that whatever our origin, whatever our purpose, whatever was intended when the first handful of clay was mixed with the first drop of divine blood, we have become something more. We have become ourselves. The tablet in the museum is just clay, but the story it holds is alive. It lives in you, in all of us. The twice created, the survivors, the children of catastrophe who built civilization from ashes and refused to forget where we came from even when we couldn't fully understand it. The gods may have made us, but we made ourselves human. And that, perhaps, is the real mystery worth contemplating as darkness pulls you down into dreams. Dreams of ancient laboratories and failed experiments, of floods and fire and the long patient work of starting over, of teachers emerging from the sea with wisdom we shouldn't have received, of bloodlines and temples and secrets written in languages we've only begun to decode. Let it all drift now. Let the questions dissolve into sleep. The answers, if they exist, will still be there in the morning. Pressed into clay, buried in stone, written in the silent spaces of our DNA, the story of our double creation, the evidence of our catastrophic past, the promise that we might, just might, have a future worth the effort it took to make us. Rest now. The ziggurat stands in memory. The tablets wait in their climate-controlled cases. The stars wheel overhead in patterns the ancient astronomers mapped with impossible precision. And you, carrier of modified genes and mythic memories and the strange, beautiful chaos of human consciousness, you are the proof that something remarkable happened here, that we are more than we seem, that our story is older and stranger than we dare admit, that we were made and unmade and made again, and somehow impossibly wonderfully we endured. If this story has stayed with you, if these ancient mysteries have resonated somewhere deep in the spaces where questions live that have no easy answers, a quiet light helps others discover these journeys through time and myth and the places where they intersect in ways that trouble our comfortable narratives. More explorations await whenever you're ready. More clay tablets with secrets still untranslated. More questions that blur the line between history and mystery. More evidence that doesn't fit the standard story. More reasons to wonder if the ancients knew something we've forgotten or dismissed. Continue whenever you're ready. Share your thoughts, your theories, your own family stories of catastrophes survived and wisdom preserved through generations. But for now, wherever you are in the world, whatever time it is, let the ancients rest. Let the questions sleep. Let the twice-created world fade into the peace of not knowing, into the comfort of mystery, into dreams. Until next time, wherever you are, whatever time it is there, sleep well, dream deep, and know that the questions will wait. The evidence will wait, the mystery will wait. Good night.